relationships working. In this case, there might be small things that would cause a change in the system, a decline in the conditions. But again, it's sort of able to sort of adjust, the system is able to adjust and slide both to the left and the right along that equilibrium line. Now the lower right is what people talk about as a critical transition or abrupt bifurcation or catastrophic bifurcation. There's different words used in the literature. But here what we have is that a system basically changes in a fundamental way and really can't regain the properties of its previous state. It becomes something different. And typically at a degraded state. And these are particularly interesting because what happens is that oftentimes there are sort of unexpected small incremental changes which release a larger system change. And examples of lake chemistry are certainly come up, and other sort of ecological examples. And again, there are social examples that we can think of as well. Again, tensions building within that system, at least at the upper line, resolving through some small individual added agent, and then a reemergence as a new condition. So those are the three states, a little bit more sort of illustrate. And again, there's just a lot of interesting stuff coming out from this literature, particularly this one gentleman, Sheffer, and a few others that he's been working with. But I think there's some interesting relevance that I'd like to sort of bring forward to the issue of climate change and other ways of urban environmental change. So what I've been doing sort of connected with that, and also sort of a general kind of historical look. I'm a geographer, but oftentimes my mind wanders backward in time, to look at how cities have changed and sort of that sense of transition. And you can find lots of examples in cities of transition. Certainly the water supply, food, when resources become scarce, the city is then sort of, grabbed with this question, well, how to keep on growing, how to maintain ourselves, how to sort of feed the, obviously we don't want to anthropomorphize cities too much, but the sense is that city is going to continue to exist. It's going to have to provide resources for the residents. And again, you can get into various critiques as well, who's going to be able to provide those resources, what's the mechanism, what's the, what's the power structure, or the sort of the leadership arrangement to provide that, or how is that going to happen? That's another question. There's lots of land use issues, sort of the collapse of, we saw lots of great examples of Sacramento. Well, in some cases there was that transformation, so something happened to those agricultural landowners. They sold out at some point, and the agricultural economy in and around Sacramento changed dramatically. In some cases that's pretty quick. There's that tipping point, if you're familiar with peri-urban areas, a tipping point where suddenly no longer makes sense. The economies of scale don't make sense for farmers, all the other ancillary things that they need to produce their crop diminishes, and you see a quick turnover in land use. There are demographic shifts, certainly that have been well documented. Probably the most obvious in the U.S. context is the idea of white flight and sort of loss of population in central cities. 2 days ago I just did a very extensive driving through of Detroit. And if you ever want a fascinating experience, go to Detroit. And so that's another example. Certainly social, socioeconomic things, both in terms of abrupt events like war, civil disruption, but also other sort of more slow and gradual things that also play out in tipping points, things like gentrification, capital investment, and reinvestment. And then, of course, there's also this issue of urban spatial development inherently leading, in many cases, to congestion, and the resolution of that, would be transformative as well, sort of getting back to that issue. So if you look at these kinds of questions, there are lots of things that you kind of have to think about. And so who's experiencing the crisis? What are the transitions? Where are they occurring in the city? Are they sort of isolated, or are they sort of interconnected to a large, vast sort of element of the system itself? I would argue that there are crises going on in the cities all the time. We just don't hear about them. They're in neighborhoods, they're tucked away. The EJ, the environmental justice community, is really kind of a flowering of that sense that these are communities within our cities that are at crisis, but they don't necessarily threaten the overall fabric of the city itself. So if you kind of have some summary thoughts on this, I would sort of throw forward a couple of ideas. Urban spatial developments really results, its process is crisis-ridden. And that many times these are rooted in the physical qualities of the city, lack of resources, lack of a whole series of potential items for development, or hazardous locations, vulnerable. They're also sometimes certainly coupled with the physical system, the social systems together, and sometimes they're more explicitly societal in origin. So it really can vary. What you see over time is that any city's history is typically full of environmental crises. I think one of the great challenges, and I know that Peter and I have had some great chats on this, and many of you would agree that the big challenge for many cities is that these crises are conflated. They're happening simultaneously. And if you look at North American cities, you oftentimes see a rolling history of one crisis resolving and another one emerging. We see in many cases today that they're compounded together. There are also failed solutions. We fail a lot. All right, we fail often. We fail more than we succeed. But eventually there's a sense of reaching this crisis where literally something has to be different, something has to change, and that oftentimes things get worse before they get better. And then environmental crises, the ones that I'm particularly looking at, these are not just sort of small every day, but these actually threaten, or at least from the mind of the residents, of the citizens, really threaten the economic vitality, continued growth of the city, and even the identity of it itself. So they're large scale. And this idea of tipping points, these are all tipping points within the context of these small crises within cities are always happening. It's that sort of larger systemic thing across a city that could be particularly troubling to the life of any particular location. And the other thing that kind of extends for some interesting literature is that these resolutions of these crises oftentimes lead to other problems, the unintended consequences certainly, and that these in turn might lead to other future crises, whether at other spatial scales, temporal scales, or social scales. So I've been sort of thinking about cities in this context and looking at some populations of various cities, and we see some kind of arrayed on the screen here. I'm not sure if I can get a pointer. So, like for example, Miami-Dade. I've done a lot of work on Miami-Dade, which is this sort of diagonal thing here, or diamond shape. Miami-Dade has been pounded by hurricanes throughout its history. I mean, some fundamentally powerful ones, but it's continued to grow. We see its population growth. So it's like, well, maybe maybe this isn't really working, maybe it's not facing it. In comparison is, let's say, like something like New Orleans. We've heard a lot about Katrina and the devastation, and certainly we can see recent estimates that population in New Orleans has declined maybe by 150,000 from the pre-Katrina level. But we also recognize that New Orleans has been losing population since 1950. So there's something else. Katrina, the impact of that hurricane is connected to a larger scale, that both metropolitan changes. I'm just looking at numbers for the city of New Orleans rather than the whole metro scale. And then other places sort of have some interesting trajectories as well. I mentioned Detroit. Well, Detroit, I don't know if I can get the arrow going again. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, this is Detroit here. That's the apex. Well, Detroit, absolutely grew dramatically until 1950. Has been losing population ever since. Now, is it in a crisis? Is there a transition going on? Again, complicated kind of concepts. San Francisco also, devastating earthquake in '06, but it continued to grow, although at a much slower rate. And then other places populations have been devastated. The Square is a population of Warsaw, really growing very dramatically in the early decades of the 20th century, absolutely devastated with World War II, and then quickly recovering and then sort of slowing up in recent decades. So there's an interesting sort of pattern, and the idea of how can we really identify these transitions and sort of figure out what they might mean into the history of cities. So I look at a couple of examples in the connection with New York, and one looking into the past and one looking into the future. In a couple minutes? Sure. Okay. So some things to think about when we look through these case studies. Do we find evidence of a transition? What were the crises? Were there crises? What were the crises leading up to the transition? Were there any early warning signals? Are things we could have thought about before we got there? What was the relevance for the resolution of the crisis itself, to urban and environmental change, and what can we translate from this experience and understanding to other cities? So we'll look at New York City water supply. So New York City began as a sort of little nub at the bottom of the island of Manhattan on the right screen, and you can see just in the middle, here, this little pond here was called the Collect Pond. That was the major source of water for the city for almost 200 years. All right, obviously not very large. Now, on the right, what you see is the massive, extensive water supply system available for the city of New York, one of the largest in the world, most resilient in terms of drought resistant and so forth. So how did this sort of shift take place? Well, we can look at a little bit of the early history and sort of recognize that as you would expect, water was a continuing, ongoing crisis for the city as it grew throughout the 1600s, 1700s, and the early 1800s. Private companies failed miserably, oftentimes, through corruption and other sort of price gouging and all the other kinds of problematic things that we could imagine. There was tremendous conflicts between, people who wanted to use the water for dumping or, water supply versus water quality. It was sort of a tremendous sort of issue. And then sort of growing from that, there was a number of other social problems and sort of crises emerging, particularly with lack of access to clean and potable water. There's also no sewage, obviously, at this point as well. The city was also expanding dramatically in terms of population, dramatic population growth. And so this is all sort of kind of flowered or sort of manifest as with increasing exposure to disease in this sort of moment of absolute tremendous transformation, issues of equity, access to resources, all the things, all the rich details that we hear of cities played out here as well. Coupled onto that was increasing outbreak of disease and the like. But connected to this was the idea of the city as the industrial, emerging industrial, but more as a trade center, and the idea that how to manage the fact that a lot of, in this the case, the disease vectors were in some cases being brought in from trade, while at the same time the city had to grow, and given this tremendous population growth. And probably sort of one of the culminating events in this sort of sequence of crises, which literally took place over about 50 years, was the Great Fire of New York in 1853, which wiped out about a quarter of the city. And it was at that point, and you can sort of go through the literature about, the elite, the business elite of the city, basically said something has to be different. If we want to move, if we want to continue our process of making money, capital accumulation, if we're going to have a viable city, we need to secure a different source of water, a stable source of water. And it's in through this resolution that you have the building of a first system of water supply, the Croton system. So it's sort of, you see the process playing out, the resolution and transition. A new source of water, that wellspring, so to speak, forwarded a whole tremendous amount of growth for the city, and in turn meant further water demand. So what I've been doing in thinking about this is sort of looking at, as a starting point, you can look through the city's history and find a set of other kind of environmental crises, which in some ways equally played upon the demands of the city and the demands for further growth, and in many cases sort of fostering further problems. One of my favorite, the streets of the city had tremendous amount of waste issues and how to deal with them. Well, the immediate way that there was dealt with in the 1870s was to dump it out into the waterways, which then caused a tremendous proliferation of other problems. Or in the early 1900s, how do you solve the congestion of New York City, of Manhattan Island? You build roads. And that was the idea. It was seen as an emancipatory activity to build roads out into the rest of New York, to spread out development. Obviously, that set forward whole sets of other problems. And what I've also started to look at is the idea of climate change as yet another potential environmental threat to the city and transition. Okay, let me just quickly step to my other example. This sort of looks a little forward. And that's as sort of ecosystem services. So one of the things to sort of touch back on this issue of transitions, we talked a lot about how to, bad transitions, going from one state to a lower state, a degraded state. But how about sort of promoting good transitions? And sort of implicit in a lot of the literature on ecosystem services is just that. To use various properties to promote urban heat island mitigation, stormwater management, water quality restoration efforts as a way of creating a more sustainable city. Well, it really kind of behind all that is this idea of promoting positive externalities among properties and sort of resources in the city, and promoting a better quality of life. And there's lots of examples of how this process is now playing out, of green infrastructure. New York City just put forward a major plan to invest about $500 million, lots of cash over a period of more than a decade or so, on promoting green infrastructure. And so if we touch back on that sort of image of critical transitions, what one could also look at is how do you create a self-propagating shift from a deteriorated state to a good state? And you can see a lot of this ecosystem literature, definitely, sort of implicit in that, the idea of creating benefits and so forth, but there really isn't any clear understanding of how you get to that point. What are some of the most effective ways or efficient ways with respect to this idea of transitions and sort of moving from a degraded state to a more beneficial state. And so how and when can an ecosystem service that is being developed or restored jump from one state to another? So you look at this image here, how can you move from this condition, which is this current degraded state in many locations, to a more beneficial ecosystem, and with that accrue benefits. Now the example I want to just end with is on oysters, and maybe that's appropriate as the stomachs start to grumble toward dinner. But New York used to be, the harbors of New York used to be one of the best oyster bed areas in the world, about 550 square kilometers of oyster beds in the harbor. They were pulling out 750 million oysters a year out of the waters in the late 19th century. All that disappeared rather quickly in the early 20th century, in some part because the waters are being polluted. They were cleaning the streets, but they were polluting the waters. So the oysters died from a number of things. But now, 100 years later, the city of New York and other cities as well are looking at the reintroduction of bivalves and other sort of creatures as a way of promoting clean water or enhancing a cleaner harbor. And people talk about the fact that oysters can filter up about 50 gallons a day. But how do you do that? Because the oysters now won't grow in this particular location, which I'm highlighting here, which is Jamaica Bay. So how do you promote these good transitions? And there's, again, there's various approaches, but one of the kind of concepts is you look at define the Achilles heel of the existing degraded system. And it's sort of a turning on the head a little bit of the idea of resilience, reduce the resilience of the bad ecosystem state that currently exists, and in that moment kind of induce a transition to a more beneficial condition with minimal effort, with the prospect of enhanced ecosystem service, as well as maybe a whole set of other potential benefits, both in economic, environmental, and equity. So these are the kinds of issues that are playing out in Jamaica Bay, and also in other cases that I could kind of go through. And we're working with a set of folks looking at this, and I don't have time, gone over way too much already, I'm sorry. But the idea of promoting some of the pre-existing, altered hydrology of the bay to promote salinity gradients, reintroduce salinity gradients is a very simple technical point, but oysters like salinity gradients from freshwater to saltwater for their habitat. So to recreate that as a jump point to move toward a good transition. All right, let me just end with a couple of thoughts. So what we can learn from past crises. They take a long time to develop. Yeah, we're in 40, 50 years, and in a lot of sense, maybe we don't have much more time, but this is sort of what we've done before. And how can we make it different, I guess, is a critical point. But this is certainly not unusual for human society. These crises emerge from underlying tensions within society, whether it's poverty, lack of access to resources, pressures for economic development. We see that playing out, certainly today. Resolutions often push the problem away in time and space. We oftentimes really resolve the root issue. And that oftentimes these resolutions foster future crises. Things get better before they get worse. And the other thing, which really hasn't been touched on too much, in general the private sector has a pretty dismal record of resolving these kinds of issues in terms of the urban question and the urban transitions. They have failed consistently. And I think it's a particularly salient point with respect to water in cities, which is now undergoing a dramatic privatization. That these companies in general have not been, or industry or private industry has not been have not been good stewards of cities. So how about the future challenges? I think it's important to recognize that cities are facing these multiple crises: climate change, poverty. Nothing more need to be said, as well as other sort of ongoing processes of environmental change with population growth. So we need to sort of dig into these processes, try to understand what the signals of change are. We need really better computational models to understand some of these transition states, and we also need tremendous more field experiments to sort of see how we can induce some of these good transitions, as I mentioned. In general, sort of a side note to ecological science, there's really a poor linkage. There's some, but it's still in the very beginning days in terms of how some of these adjustments can provide ecological services, and we need some better understanding about bringing that science out into the policy arena. And then, of course, coupling all this together, economic development with ecological services. Kind of pressing on through all of this is the issue of governance, governance opportunities to promote this